Today's guest is Bo Burlingham. Bo Burlingham was the editor-at-large at Inc. magazine for over 25 years. He's currently a contributing writer for Forbes Magazine and is an author with 5 books. Bo, thanks for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure, Tats. What got me started on Small Giants was really that I had written an article about a company in Ann Arbor, Michigan called Zingermans. And it was a company, it was an interesting company that it started out as a delicatessen in Ann Arbor, and 2 guys had started it, and their goal was to be great and unique. And they didn't want it to be like a copy of any other delicatessen. And, they wanted to be recognized for their uniqueness and for their greatness, for what a wonderful place it would be. And, they started in 1982 and within 10 years, they really had achieved all of that. In fact, they were being written up all over the place. There were articles in Gourmet and Bon Appetit and the Washington Post and New York Times, every place, about what a great delicatessen Zingerman's was. So they came to a crossroad, which a lot of successful companies reach, and that is, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And it was a question that they felt they really had to address. And so, although I would say this, one of the partners became very clear that they had to address it, and he sort of interrupted the other partner in the middle of, I don't know, measuring cheese at the deli or something like that. And Paul Saginaw said to his partner Ari Weinzweig, Ari, you got to stop. We got to talk about something. And Ari said, what do we have to talk about? And Paul said, what are we going to do in 10 years? Where are we going to be in 10 years? And Ari said, Paul, I've got to finish cutting this cheese. Can you please wait for that? And so actually that began a process where they talked about what it was. Now, they had lots of opportunities about, they could have, they were famous and they already had people sort of coming to them wanting to set up Zingermans in college towns all over the country. And they could have easily franchised if that's what they wanted to do. They could have probably raised money and started their own Zingermans in other places around the country. But they decided they really didn't want to do that. They had, started the company in order to create something great and unique. And when you start replicating something, it's no longer unique by definition. And a lot of times it isn't even very good, let alone great. Ari Weinzweig said, he told Paul, he said, look, I don't want to spend my life on an airplane to Kansas City to visit some mediocre Zingermans to see if the coleslaw is fresh. That's not how I want to spend my life. And Paul agreed and said, okay, well, I don't want to do that either. Let's figure out what it is that we do want to do. And they came up with a plan. And the plan they introduced in 1994 was called Zingerman's 2009. And it was their vision of what Zingerman's was going to look like 15 years in the future. And they decided that, well, they would no longer just be a delicatessen. They'd be a whole collection of food-related businesses. And actually, each of those businesses would be great and unique in its own right. So you could have a bakery, you could have a coffee making company, a coffee roastery. You could have a creamery and make cheese and gelato. You could have restaurants, obviously. There's a whole number of things that you could do, and their goal was they looked at this and And the more they thought about it, the more they thought, yes, this is a good idea. This is the way we should go. Of course, a lot of people were telling them they were crazy at that point because they had an absolutely ideal opportunity to grow just by growing over the country. That would be sort of the normal thing to do. I mean, I remember Ari at one point called me up and said, "Listen, we're planning to do this, but um, the our lawyers are telling us that this is nuts." I said, "Well, okay, let me give you somebody to talk to. It's not nuts, Ari. It's just different." Um, so, and they had, and you know, they wanted obviously to have great service for their customers, and this would actually allow them to have even better service because they'd be controlling, for example, the baked goods that they sold or the cheese and so forth. They wanted to have a great place to work for their employees, and this actually would create opportunities for employees. Some of those employees might actually like to run some of these businesses, and so it would give them the opportunity to grow. And they wanted it to be, they always wanted to be great citizens of their community, namely the Ann Arbor, the greater Ann Arbor community. And, you know, this would give them more opportunity to do that. And so they rolled this out. And by the time I went to visit them, which was, you know, another 10 years later, actually, in probably 2002, you know, they were more than halfway there. And the thing that really blew me away was the kind of people that they were able to attract. I mean, they were able to attract people who had, you know, entrepreneurs who sold their businesses because they wanted to come and be part of this. You know, people who'd been partners in national accounting firms who were willing to take huge pay cuts in order to be part of this. And you know, it was just really an amazing collection of people to see and to see, having been at that time, the business really wasn't very big. It was only about doing about $10 million, but they were a year, but they had attracted just an incredible lineup of people. And so I decided that this was something I wanted to write about, and I wrote an article for Inc. magazine called "The Coolest Small Company in America," namely Zingermans, and it got a big response from our readers. Readers were sort of turned on by this idea, and one of the people who read it and liked it was actually a publisher in New York. And he called me up and he said, "I love that article. Do you think there's a book there?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. It might be a book for Ari and Paul. I didn't see how there was a book for me." He said, "Well, come down to New York and we'll talk about it." And when I got down to New York, he said, "Well, I'm not talking about doing a book about Zingerman's. I'm talking about, you know, the fact that, you know, you had a company here that had the opportunity to get a lot bigger a lot faster, but chose not to because it had other goals they considered more important." He said, "I wonder how many other companies there are that are similar to that." And I had been working at Inc. magazine by that point for, I don't know, over 20 years. And um, I thought, gee, that's a really good question. I have no idea what the answer to that is. So I decided to go out and investigate. And I basically talked to everybody I knew and told them what I was doing. And I also went through back issues of Inc. and, you know, tried to come up with names of companies. And I had no idea how many I would find or if I'd find any at all. And in fact, what happened was that there were many, many more than I had ever suspected, and that you could find them in pretty much any industry and in any part of the country. And that gave me the luxury of choosing companies that I thought would really allow me to explore this phenomenon and of companies as the subtitle says, choosing to be great instead of big. Uh, all these companies were growing, so it's not about not growing. Uh, it was about whether or not they were willing to grow at any cost. And the answer was I was looking for companies that had basically said no, that they weren't willing to grow at any cost, that they had certain things, certain ideals, certain goals that they wanted to accomplish. And so I did choose a bunch of these companies, and I wrote about them in Small Giants. And basically, what I looked for, they all had a certain quality which I had seen in companies when I first started writing at Inc. magazine. In the early 1980s, there were a whole lot of companies around that, today they're household names like Microsoft and Apple and so forth, Patagonia. They were just young companies back then. And the best of them, had a certain quality, sort of electricity about them. I didn't have a name for it, but I came up with one, namely Mojo. This is this was it was actually one of the people I wrote about, Gary Erickson of Cliff Bar, who told me a story that identified it for me. It was actually about another company which somebody told him had lost its mojo, and so Gary understood that. Wait a minute, what's mojo? Do we have it? Are we losing it? And so anyway, I all these companies that I looked for had it, and I wanted to know sort of where it came from. What were they all doing that allowed them to have this very special quality that made people want to be associated with it? Sort of like charisma.
Mm.
When a leader has charisma, you want to follow him or her. When a business has mojo, you want to be associated with that business. You want to buy from it. You want to sell to it. You want to work for it. You want to wear its T-shirts and caps and so forth. And I decided to look at what they did in common, and I wound up coming up with 6 specific things that I felt all these companies really had in common. It was really their definition of greatness. They all had a very similar definition. It really had to do with the people that they were associated with. I mean, number one, they were all one of the characteristics was that they were all led by people who had a very clear idea of what they wanted, who they were, and why they wanted it. And they really needed that because basically they were doing something that the people around them were telling them was crazy. That they were passing up opportunities, and they had to be really clear in their own minds that that's okay. These are the other things that I really want to do, and this is more important to me. The second thing was really the effect that these companies had in their communities. It's not just they gave back a lot to their communities, but they had the personality of the company was actually molded by the communities where they were located. As Ari told me, it's sort of like what the French call terroir, which is that there's a quality that particular location has. I mean, Zingermans is very much a sort of Ann Arbor community. I wrote about Anchor Brewing, which really started the whole craft brewing revolution, and it's very much a San Francisco company. Now you can have great craft, as we know, you're going to have great craft brewers all over the world, but in fact, Anchor Brewing was a company that belonged in San Francisco. It was a San Francisco landmark. And that was very important to its identity. So the third one I noticed what really had to do with their relationship with their customers. And the thing that struck me about those relationships was how personal they were. I mean, even companies that had like hundreds of or thousands or millions
Mm.
of customers still tried to make the relationships as um, personal as possible. Um, you know, um, it's one thing to do when you're small and you only have, a handful of customers. It's another thing to do when you do have hundreds of thousands. I mean, one of the companies I wrote about was a record company called Righteous Babe Records. And, this was started by a woman, a singer named Ani DeFranco, who's still performing actually. And she was being pursued by all of the big record companies who wanted to sign her up, and she decided no, she didn't want to do that. So she started her own record company in Buffalo, New York, and it became very successful. And it began, you know, bringing out music from other people besides Ani DeFranco. And when I went to visit them, they would get emails and mail and gifts and all kinds of letters and so forth from literally all over the world because she had all of these, fans. And the fact is that every single person who wrote into Righteous Babe Records received a personal handwritten note from somebody. I mean, it wasn't Ani herself couldn't do it, but they had people who really made sure that every single person who wrote in would get a handwritten note, and because that was again, it was part of maintaining that personal connection. Uh, and ironically, the fourth characteristic had to do with the employees, namely, in many cases, in fact, in all the cases, the customers didn't come first. It was the employees who came first. And of course, when you think about it, that's easy to understand, namely that, um, after a company gets above a certain size, it's not the founder or the CEO who is dealing with all the customers. And if you want to have really great customer service, you better have employees who feel very good about the company they're working for. And that's, again, that was something that all these companies had. Um, the fourth characteristic, I came out with the first edition of the book in 2005, actually end of 2005, 2006. And um, I realized very soon after that I'd missed something.
Mm.
And because one of the companies that I had written about, a company called Rael Precision Manufacturing, which actually make laptop hinges. They were, when you have a laptop, you open the top, it doesn't fall right down, and that's because of something called a constant torque hinge. And Rael was by far the really the developer and master of laptop hinges, and had been doing extremely well. And then shortly afterwards, I realized that there had been big changes. They had two CEOs at the time. One of the CEOs had retired, and another one had been fired. And I called up and got somebody to talk to me off the record because they couldn't talk to me on the record because there were lawsuits all over the place. And I said, well, this doesn't sound very great, but I knew I had to write about it. And I wound up doing an article for Inc. magazine again about what had happened at Rael. And what had happened was that they had made a mistake. They had allowed, they had, when they were making these laptop hinges, it was one thing when all of the manufacturing was in the United States.
Mm.
It was another thing when the manufacturing moved to Asia, and um, they still continued to go with it. And the the the, the danger that they got into is they suddenly found themselves competing against other companies who could do what they did for much less money.
Mm.
And they had a choice. Either they could drop their prices and try and survive that way and maintain market share, or or they could let the business go. At least that's what they felt the choice was, and they didn't want to let the business go because it would mean they'd have to lay off people um, at their factory in Minnesota, and so they decided to go after that business, for good reasons, which was that they really felt very loyal to their employees and they wanted to protect those jobs. But when you are letting your gross margins, when you're reducing your prices to the point where you're not making any money anymore, uh, pretty soon that catches up with you, and if you're not careful, you're not going to have a company anymore. And they got into that's what happened, which is when I went to visit them afterwards, they had um, really they were selling more laptop hinges than ever, and they were losing money on every single one of them. And so that I realized that was a factor that I had to do. There was a chapter missing from the book, and that chapter was how small giants fail.
Mm.
And so I talked to my publisher, and we realized that we should bring out another edition of Small Giants. It became the 10th anniversary edition, and I included their new chapter called "How Small Giants Fail." And basically, again, I wrote there about there were like three conditions that I thought companies had to be very careful about, because you can do lots of wonderful things for your employees and for your customers and for your community, but if you don't have a business, you can't do any of that. So I said, number one, they had to protect their gross margins. Number two, they had to have uh, a sound business model that that was flexible enough to change, because as the environment changes, the business model has to change. And number three, they had to have a strong balance sheet, that and that if they didn't sort of stay on top of their balance sheet, that they could get into deep trouble. And I gave some examples of companies that had done that. And so that became the fifth characteristic. The sixth characteristic really had something to do with the way their leaders felt about whatever it was that their companies did. It not just how they felt about their companies, but it was about Anchor Brewing. What did Fritz Maytag feel about beer? And there was a woman, a dressmaker. What did she feel about what she was doing? And there was this kind of passion that they had for it that you could see in all of them, in all of the leaders, which is that they were so crazy about whatever it was that their companies did, that they wanted everybody to feel this, to have the same feelings about it, to love it as much as they did, and that became contagious. Their love of their business, really of what their businesses did, sort of rubbed off on other people, and especially their employees. And but also, this is where a lot of the mojo came from.
Mm,
And so I realized that that was another factor. In other words, these were not people who were just doing something because they couldn't find anything better to do. This was these were big companies that were being run by people who really felt that what they were doing was important to the world, and that
mm,
they were making a contribution to the world by doing it.
mm,
And so those were really the six different characteristics. And the book came out, and it got very it got it hit a responsive note with a lot of companies and a lot of people. And I eventually, what people were telling me, you've got a great opportunity here. You should go out, and you could create a whole organization around this. There are all these companies out there. And I thought about it, and finally, I was having dinner with one person, and he was a guy named Paul Spiegelman, and he was somebody. He was an entrepreneur who had a great company, and he was one of the ones who said, why aren't you doing something with this? And I said, listen, Paul, um, I'm a journalist. I write about businesses. I am not an entrepreneur myself, and I understand the difference. I don't think I'd be a very good entrepreneur for a variety of reasons. But I agree with you that there is an opportunity here, but it really requires somebody who knows how to build an organization and who has the financial resources to be able to take lots of losses during the early stages of that happening, uh, so that it can actually happen. And I said, Paul, if you wanted to do that, I would support you, but I can't do it myself. But I'm happy to lend whatever weight I have to your efforts to create a small giants community. And he took that very seriously. And in fact, he did start the Small Giants community with my support, and it's been going ever since. I mean, I guess we're going on 12 years now, and it's actually very successful. We do a summit every year, and we in addition, the community has a leadership program, because there are a lot of these companies where uh, the leaders really identify with the whole idea of small giants, and they want their companies to be small giants, but they have another generation coming up, and they want those people to feel the same way about it. And so we found that they're willing to send people to this leadership program, which is a great program. I mean, people love it. And and then, there are a bunch of other things that we do. And then what happened was that Forbes came along. I mean, I was working at Inc., but a friend of mine who used to be my editor at Inc. Wound up at Forbes Magazine, and he called me and said that he'd talked to people at Forbes, and that they like to do a list of the best small companies, but what they were doing was ridiculous, because all the best small companies they listed were public companies. And as you know, Tots, that's a very small minority of small companies.
yeah.
And so they'd asked him what they should do, and he said, well, you should use this methodology that my friend Bo Burlingham came up with to select his companies for 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 his book Small Giants. So he asked me if I would come over from Inc. magazine and help put together this list on an annual basis, and I agreed to do that. This was in 2015. The first list we produced was for 2016, and we've done it every year since. We're working actually on the 2020 list right now, but we get nominations from all over,
Yeah.
and the fact is that there are lots and lots of companies that have these same values and these same ambitions, and they want to be great companies. In other words, they want to create great places to work. They want to create great products and services for their customers. They want to be pillars of their community, and anything that they can do to do that better, they're willing to do. And if we can help them, I mean, there's no question that makes makes the world a better place when you have people doing that. See, I've written a book, another book with Jack Stack called The Great Game of Business, and SRC Holdings is one of the companies that we've had on the list. And then there are, I'm trying to think of their.
Yeah, Jack's. I guess he did the open book management, right? He's famous.
That's right.
Yeah.
He pretty much invented that, and in fact, a lot of the companies, a lot of the small giants companies, are practicing the system essentially that he developed at SRC, which is called The Great Game of Business. And there's actually a methodology that they teach to other companies, and it's so they've been very successful with that.
Yeah, what's just to go a little further in the open book, what are the challenges of getting people on there? Like they're interested, but where did people get stuck?
You mean with open book management?
Yeah.
Well, it's usually their own fears.
Okay.
The owners, tend to be, not everyone now, because the whole atmosphere has changed so tremendously since we wrote that book back in the early 1990s. But back then, a lot of people thought Jack was crazy. It was like, what are you doing sharing all these numbers with your employees? And Jack said, look, well, I'll put it in my words, but
sure.
Basically, he said, look, you have two companies. Suppose you have two companies and they each have 100 employees. And in one of the companies, you've got, 5, 10, 15, 20 people at the top. And then you've got all the other people who are waiting to be told what to do. In the other company, you've got 100 people, and all of these people know exactly what the business needs to do to succeed and can do it on their own and can think about it. Which of those two companies is going to be more successful? Well, it's a no-brainer, right? Which is that obviously, if you have a workforce of people who understand the business, know exactly what they have to do to contribute to that business's success, that company is going to be much more successful. And that's what, there are literally thousands of companies that have adopted this system, and most of them say that it's, when we ask them if they're applying for small giants, one of the things we ask companies is what their turning points, do they have turning points? And a lot of them say it was bringing in the Great Game of Business, that was a critical turning point for them. And the numbers before and after are pretty amazing.
Really interesting. What other turning points besides that do you hear about?
With the small giants?
Yeah. When you ask that question, what else comes up?
Well, let me see. Usually, often there may be a change in leadership
Okay.
at some point, and people will cite that change in leadership as being critical to the success, to the change in the company. Sometimes there'll be an event that occurs that has a huge effect on the company, but usually something. It often has to do with gaining clarity about what there's one company I'm thinking about that basically they were in terrible shape. I mean, they were a typical small business. They were a sausage making company, and they got to a point. It was a typical small business in the sort of a benevolent dictatorship, right? Where you had somebody at the top who basically was responsible for everything, and everybody sort of wanted to know. He felt that he was responsible for everything, and he got burned out, and he got really depressed and tired, and he went away on vacation, and he had an experience while he was away, which he can describe better than I can, but it was basically he came to a realization that he had to try something else, and that he didn't know what it was, but that he had to be open to new ideas about how to run a business. And one of the first things that he wound up doing was bringing in something called value-based leadership. And there's a whole methodology that is associated with that, where you actually sort of consciously, you and the people in your organization consciously look at, well, what are our values here? What are the key values of this company? And then, they think about what's their mission statement? Why are we in business anyway? Here we're spending all this time here. We come in every day. Why are we doing this? Aside from the fact that we need to put food on the table, and then they do a vision statement as well, which is also part of value-based leadership, which is, well, where do we want to be in 10 years? If this is why we're in business, where do we want to get to? And those become very critical things. And then, they were doing that. This company, the sausage company, that had a huge impact, but they still had a problem, which was that their sales, went through the roof. They had a terrific increase in sales, but they were losing money. They had 2 months where they lost more money than they ever had in their 20-year history. And so the CEO called up somebody, Vern Harnish, who is really the founder of EO, and told Vern what was going on, and Vern said, "You need the great game of business," and he put this person, Michael is his name, in touch with the great game of business, and they began implementing the great game of business, and they went from losing money to the first quarter of 2018. They were losing money at the end of 2017. The first quarter of 2018 was the most profitable in the firm's history. So those are kinds of things that happen that that we hear about, and frankly, I'm sure that what's going on right now is going to that we'll be hearing about this, about how this is obviously a huge factor in everybody's lives here in the States, actually in the world. I shouldn't just say the States. And um, you know, things are going to change. Things are going to happen during this period um, that will prove to be a turning point for companies. Hopefully, a turning point for the better. And I wrote another book called Finish Big, which is about exiting your
Mm.
company, and we could certainly talk about that for a long time as well. Because if you do a search on Google or whatever it is, or starting a business or growing a business, you get billions, literally billions of hits. If you search for exiting a business, you get millions. You might get 10 or 30 million or something like that, but it's much less. And uh, so actually, when I did actually start to write Finish Big, I realized I didn't know anything. I had one experience, and I didn't know anything beyond that experience. So I had to educate myself, and so I went out and talked to as many people as I could who had been through it. And uh, the thing that I discovered, which really surprised me, was that uh, when you ask people after they had actually gone through this experience of exiting their business, were they happy?
Mm.
And something like, well, at least 50%, in some cases it might be more, 60%, were not happy.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, some of them were really miserable. And so I thought, well, gee, that's a book. What's the difference between the ones who are happy and the ones who are miserable?
Yeah.
So that's really what Finish Big is about.
Yeah. What were the quick high levels on a few things why they were miserable?
A lot of them, they lost their sense of purpose.
Ah.
They didn't know who they were anymore. They said the worst question that somebody could ask them was, "What do you do?"
Mm.
And they didn't know how to answer. And that's one reason. Another reason, if you've been, if you've been running a business for 10 or 20 years and
Mhm.
you go into the office every day, there's a whole group of people who you get to know and you're very close to.
Yeah.
Suddenly you don't have them around anymore either. Um, you know, it, there are a whole bunch of things that have, here's another thing. One of the things about being in business is that the business sort of tells you what you need to do.
Yeah.
When you get up in the morning and okay, well, what do I have to do today and so forth, you have an answer to it. When you suddenly nobody, you could do anything, um, that's actually not such a great thing. It can be very, very disorienting. Plus, you know after a little while, another thing about business that you get from business is you get a sense of progress. In other
Mm.
words, you're going from here to there and you're improving and so forth. Well, suddenly you don't have that anymore. You can just feel lost. And that's really what happened with a lot of people. I think but I decided ultimately that the biggest thing was something else. When I found people who had actually had good exits, almost all of them were engaged in helping other people.
Mm.
And I thought, particularly other entrepreneurs. And when I thought about it, I thought, well, in your business, what are you doing? You're serving a lot of people. You go into business, you're serving yourself and your family for sure. You're serving your customers. If you're not serving them, you're not going to be in business very long. Um, Most people, you're serving your employees. Um, you know, you're really, it's business is really, when it's done right, is really about serving lots of people. And that's where your sense of purpose comes from. it's like I'm doing this because what the answer to that is, and um, that when you don't have that, it can be extremely disorienting. It's like, well, why am I here? Why am I on Earth? Um, and it can be, I mean, it can be very, very difficult. So um, I would say that people would ask me afterwards, well, how do I prepare for this? How do I think about this? And I said, well, think about who you're going to serve afterwards, um, because you're going to need that in your life. You're going to need that sense of purpose that you're helping other people, and that is really the key thing. That's really I mean, there are a lot of other things. I came up with basically 8 things that the happy people did that the unhappy people didn't do, and that's what the book is about. Um, but if I think about the number one most important thing, it's having that sense of purpose of who you are, what you're doing, and why.